Hello, welcome everybody to this Art Unlocked talk with the Armitt Museum, Gallery and Library based in Ambleside in Cumbria, the UK. It's lovely to speak to you this evening. My name is Faye Morrissey. I'm the manager and curator here at the Armitt. So welcome to all of those of you who know the Armitt, have been to it, and welcome to those of you who perhaps don't know anything about the museum at all. So what I'd like to do to start off with is just tell you a little bit about the Armitt itself, its history, how it came to be, some of its collections, and then I'll move through to talk about some of our key artwork pieces that are part of this presentation. So the Armitt has been in existence since 1912 when it was first founded. So we're coming up to our 110-year anniversary in November. The Armitt was founded by a lady called Mary Louisa Armitt. She was one of three sisters who were born and raised in Salford near Manchester, just south of Cumbria, not too far away. And they were a trio of very well-educated young women. At the time, their father, and perhaps unusually for this period in Victorian England, really wanted his daughters to be well educated. And the sisters went on to have great passions in a variety of different subjects, from art, literature, musicology, botany, history, and they really excelled in many of these subject areas. Mary Louisa Armitt was particularly interested in history and musicology. Now, out of the three sisters, only one of them ever married, and that was Annie Armitt. Sophia and Mary Louisa never did. And Annie moved up to the Lake District when she married her husband and lived around the area of Ambleside, Rydal, Hawkshead for a number of years before her husband sadly passed away and her other two sisters moved up to join her. And all three of them lived together in Rydal, which is just up the road from where we are today. And the Armitt sisters really set themselves in with the Victorian intellectuals of the day. They knew people such as Wordsworth, Ruskin, Collingwood, Beatrix Potter, and Charlotte Mason. And some of these names I'll talk a little bit about as we go through the talk today. So in terms of the Armitt being set up, Mary Louisa really wanted there to be a place in Ambleside where book lovers and academics could come to. She also wanted it to become a museum, a place where through the long past to the present, people could look at different objects and artifacts that would tell a story and a history of Ambleside and its surrounding lakeland world. And that's really what we try and hold true to the present day. Sadly, Mary Louisa passed away in 1911, just 1 year before the Armitt was formally established. So she wasn't able to see her will and her wish put into place, which is quite sad. And it was only Annie Armitt that was actually left at the time, and she was quite ill, but she still found a great passion to see through some of the early years of the Armitt for her sister's benefit. And the Armitt started off as a subscription library. So it was a collection of the Armitt sisters' books, but it also amalgamated the Ambleside Ruskin Library and the Ambleside Book Society. So it started out with around 1,400 books, but it's quickly started to grow. And this was through the fact of having very prominent and well-established members in its circle. And this included people such as Beatrix Potter, or Beatrix Heelis, as she was then called, because she was obviously married. And the collection started to grow. And it was through donations and bequests that the Armitt started becoming so much more than a library. And through to the present day, we have so many different aspects to our collection, including the library, but also museum artifacts, artworks, some of which I'll talk to you through now. And we're really pleased to still be growing our collection year on year. And so Beatrix Potter was a really big aspect to the Armitt, and we're really lucky to have some of her key artworks from her early years. But I won't talk too much about that now, as it will come up in a second. So this presentation will take you through a selection of artworks that I've picked out from the Armitt's collection, ones that I particularly enjoy, either for the artist, the sitter, the style, or its associated history or story. And I've chosen to show this presentation in the format of date order or chronological order in terms of the artwork's production. But there might be one at the end that differs slightly, and you'll see why shortly. So we come to the first piece of artwork that I'd like to talk to you about. This is by a chap called William Green. It shows the Bridge House, which is based in Ambleside, and it's a soft ground etching completed in 1821. Now, William Green was a talented landscape painter, watercolourist, and draftsman. His artworks clearly observe an accurate eye for detail and an architectural technique, which hopefully you can see from this. William Green produced numerous views of the Lake District available for sale to visitors, but he also created quite large sets of drawings and etchings, including 60 studies from nature in 1810, 16 etchings and 36 etchings in 1821, amongst others. Now, I've chosen this particular image of William Green's because it shows an iconic building associated with Ambleside. If you come to Ambleside, I'm sure you're going to have spotted this, taken your picture against it, or just enjoyed seeing the beck trickle beneath the house itself. So the Bridge House itself, it was then in 1821, as you can see from this image, surrounded by the natural world, its greenery, the trees behind it, and it looks quite different to now, which is much more modern. It's almost the only building of that age in and amongst and surrounded by the modern world that's developed up around it. So for a bit of background on the Bridge House, it was built in the late 17th or the early 18th century by the Braithwaite family of Ambleside Hall. The Braithwaites were the leading family for Ambleside for possibly 200 years, and they were thought to have made much of their wealth through the trade and the wool industry in particular. Now, in William Green's 1819 guide to the Lake District, entitled The Tourist New Guide, yes, he wrote as well, Green described Ambleside Hall as the ancient family seat of the Braithwaites, not a remnant of which is left, acknowledging basically that the Bridge House was the most notable relic from that time in Ambleside which was left. And while the surroundings of Bridge House, as I say, have changed distinctly since its construction, the building has basically served as a constant reminder to many of us of the olden time from that period. And one Harriet Martineau, who was a sociologist of the day, pointed out that Bridge House was the most curious relic in Ambleside of that time. So despite its curiosities in its architecture, some accounts suggest that Bridge House was originally built with a purely functional purpose in mind. So due to it being close to an orchard called Brigg Orchard, which was also owned by the Braithwaites, it's thought that Bridge House originally served as a storeroom for the orchard's apples. But it was also rumoured to have been built in such a strange manner so that the Braithwaites could avoid paying land tax. Built over a river, therefore you don't need to pay that land tax. Sneaky. And William Green, however, had proposed the notion the Bridge House was originally built as a summer house for the Braithwaites of Ambleside Hall. So when the Tourist New Guide was published in 1819, Green did note that by that period, it was contemporarily serving as both a tea room and a weaving shop. So times have moved on, its function and changed purpose has altered. And over the years, it served a variety of other purposes, including an antique shop, a shoe shop, a pigeon loft. And at one point, Bridge House was the home to a chairmaker called John Rigg, or colloquially known as Cherry Rigg, who supposedly lived there with his wife and 6 children. And that's something that visitors really enjoy hearing about. So though the structure is still largely the same as at the time of its conception, changes have been made over the years which reflect the building's shift in its purpose. And during the time that it was a tea room in the early 19th century, a cast iron stove was put in and installed, and it's still there today and it still works. So in addition to these changes, and I'll give the final word to William Green from his comments on the glass windows, and he says about them, the beauties derived from time have been injured by the introduction of glass into the window frames. So I think we can all safely say he wasn't a fan of what had taken place in its changes. So the second artwork, and I said I'd come back to Beatrix Potter, here she is from our collection of 300 or so pieces of Beatrix's fungi and natural history watercolours that she bequeathed to the Armitt. Now, this one that you see on the screen is a really popular watercolour, and it's titled Lecanum versipel. So many of Beatrix's works can be attributed to a place and a year, but sadly, this one is actually unknown. But it is a favourite of many of our visitors due to its colour, its vibrancy, and perhaps commonality of being found in nature. Now, Beatrix first became interested in fungi from an early age when nannies would tell her stories of fairies dancing around mushrooms. So she was really captured by the idea of magic, as well as their colours and their shapes and their textures. Beatrix, as a young lady and as a small child, would often visit museums in London where she lived most of her time during her childhood life. And through those trips and visits out, she was able to learn and study the natural world. And then when her family would take long summer holidays, and I mean long, I mean, we don't get them the same anymore, she would experience the landscape and the flora and the fauna for herself. And she would often bring back many different specimens, including animals, to her home. In fact, with her brother Bertram, they created quite a menagerie. And it was on one of her summer holidays in Scotland where Beatrix first met the postman and amateur naturalist called Charles Mackintosh. Beatrix and Charlie, as he was fondly known, became quite close correspondents, and soon Charlie was sending fungi specimens in the post to Beatrix back in London. This other artwork of fungi, also by Beatrix Potter, does this time indicate a date and place of collection. It was completed in 1895 and it was collected at Holherd near Windermere, just very close to us, just in fact down the road from where I am now. So as Beatrix's story with fungi continues, she avidly painted these specimens between the 1880s and 1890s. And she started becoming more and more knowledgeable on the science of fungi, particularly with the help from Charlie. In return for specimens that he sent in the post, which sometimes arrived okay, other times not so well, she would ask for his support with the identification. This eventually led her to experimenting with fungi on the reproduction of their spores. So as this fungi example shows, Beatrix was painting them now not only just for their shape and their colour, but she was trying to find out more about their science. So you can see here that she's drawn the fungi as it would have been found in situ in nature, but she's also turned it upside down to have a look at the roots, and she's also dissected them and been able to paint them for what they look like when they're on the inside. So through her delve into the science of fungi, Beatrix took regular journeys to places such as the Natural History Museum and Kew Gardens. This is where she met a number of people, particularly men of the time, who found it difficult to understand why she should be pursuing this interest. Botany was quite common amongst women in this period, but mycology, not quite so. Nevertheless, she carried on, and in 1897, she actually submitted a paper to the Linnaean Society on the germination of spores. And sadly, this paper no longer exists, or at least that we know of, and it wasn't published. This is due to the fact that Beatrix, as a woman, wasn't actually able to go and present in person to the society. So a Mr. George Massey had to do so on her behalf. And he reported back that the paper was well received, but it was considered needing more work. And this obviously affected Beatrix quite substantially because by 1900, so only 3 years after she'd written this paper, she'd basically stopped painting fungi in this way altogether. And her book on Peter Rabbit had come out. It was starting to become quite a success from its initial publishing. And she realised she could make quite a comfortable living out of being an author. However, if you look closely at her illustrations in her books, you will see that the accurate approach to drawing and the technique that she developed, it still resides. And you might still find a few fungi popping up here and there on some of the pages. Now, the Armitt is incredibly grateful to have this collection, this amazing collection by Beatrix Potter. She bequeathed some 300 of her original works to the Armitt on her death in 1943. And these artworks make up a core part of the Armitt's offer and its experience to the public. It enables us to tell a completely different side of Beatrix's life and her story. And of course, they're remarkable pieces in their own right, and they really still do inspire people today. The next artwork that I'd like to talk about is this one here. It's an oil on canvas work by Frederick Yates, and it displays the sitter Charlotte Mason. Now, firstly, a bit about the artist. Frederick Yates was both a portrait and a landscape painter during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was born in the UK before moving out to America, and then returning back to the UK and eventually settling in the Lake District. He gained a lot of important contacts during his time abroad, as well as being in England. And this was helped by the fact that he had a patron in the form of the Dowager Marchioness of Downshire, and she introduced him to a lot of London society particularly. As such, he was invited and commissioned to paint a number of portraits, including of some substantial people, including the President of Hawaii, and then later the President of America, Woodrow Wilson. So quite a coup. During his time in and around society in London, may have been the time that he met the sitter here, which is one Charlotte Mason. And so now we come to talk about her. Now, Charlotte Mason was a pioneer of homeschooling, and she set up her house of education here in Ambleside in the late 1800s. It was formed as a place for young women to develop the skills to go on to be great governesses, in fact, excellent ones. And her principles were focused on nature and the outdoors, and these were being extremely important in influencing and the learning of many different subject matters, not just science and geography, but arts and literature too. Charlotte Mason had met Fred Yates at a friend's house in London, so perhaps during his time with society. And she invited him, or commissioned him more likely, to complete this portrait in 1901-2. It was at this time as well that Mason invited Yates to instruct and teach one of her art classes as part of her house of education. She specifically wanted him to show the work of Jean-Francois Millet to the class, and having been well versed in this particular French artist for many years, Yates was only too obliging. Neither was he fazed by the fact that he had no materials or limited materials and no reference work whatsoever. So he actually decided to sketch out his examples on the walls of a building. Wow. He didn't manage, or he didn't even imagine that they would stay, but Mason was so keen to keep them up that you can still find 9 of Yates's reproduction Millets in some of the now offices of the University of Cumbria. I've seen them, they're incredible. A lot of Fred Yates pieces that the Armitt holds are actually pastel works, unlike the Charlotte Mason, which is an oil commission. Here we can see our founder of the Armitt, Mary Louisa. She, with her other sisters, and an early trustee of the Armitt, Herbert Bell, all had their portraits completed by Yates, and they reside in our collection. Other works by Fred Yates can also be found across Cumbria, including at Abbot Hall in Kendal, Kendal Town Hall, Cumbria Archives, Brantwood, and Dove Cottage at Grasmere. But what can we deduce about the fact that the Armitt sisters were completed in pastel? Was it that they weren't commissioned, so they were done cheaply or as a favour? Was it a preliminary work that could have been made into an oil at a later date, but time or money didn't allow? Or was it simply a preferred medium by the artist or the sitter? Perhaps we'll never know. But in any case, Yeats has clearly captured the likeness to our founder, as it's quite comparable to other images of Mary Louisa that we have, as well as her sisters. And if it was done quickly, as in the style of his Millet work on the walls of a building, I don't think I'd be displeased with this result. Another significant and in recent years growing collection of works that the Armitt has pursued to acquire are these this example, which is by the avant-garde artist Kurt Schwitters. This example is called Landscape with Tree and was completed in oils in 1946. Schwitters was born in Hanover in 1887. He studied at Dresden, and through the arrival of the Dada movement, he found the freedom to create what many others see as a singular style of art that he alone can be attributed to. His imagination was constantly working in overdrive. Perhaps Schutter's most significant work was the creation of his Mertzbaus, however. He made them in different locations where he lived, including Norway, Germany, and the Lake District. Schwitters arrived in the lakes in the later years of his life. Although he had travelled and visited the area on a number of occasions during his lifetime, he ended up here in 1945 after making the decision to leave Nazi Germany in 1937. He went via Norway, had a time interred on the Isle of Man, but effectively he left Nazi Germany because his art was considered degenerate. Schwitters, like those I've mentioned before, sold works to visitors, but he also took missions, which is where he would make most of his money. We even know that he would sell works from the steps of Bridge House, going back to the first image that I showed to you, in the town. And this view in particular that we're looking at is likely to be somewhere in Ambleside or in the Lake District, somewhere wider afield, although the title isn't very clear as to that. Most of the works in the Armitt's collection by Schwitters are paintings. However, Schwitters was keen on many different art forms, with a substantial amount being assemblages such as this one. And this is the only one of an assemblage that we actually possess in the Armitt's collection. It's called Wood on Wood. He would use found material to create his work, and therefore bringing the landscape into his creations. And this is a quote directly from Kurt himself. He says, "I'm Kurt Schwitters. I'm a painter and I nail my pictures together." Quite accurate in this sense. Schwitters was also much more than just an artist. He was a writer, designer, sculptor, and a poet. His story is a really important one connected with the lakes, and we're really looking forward to doing more with his work and putting on more exhibitions in the future. So if he is a particular inspiration to you, do look out for more things that we'll be doing. In 1996-7, the Armitt acquired a new and permanent home, based where I am now, in a purpose-built building at the tip of the University of Cumbria campus. Shortly after the opening in the new home, this sculpture was put in place by the artist Josephina de Vasconcelos. Josephina was born in London in 1904. Her artistic talents were encouraged by her parents, and in 1921 she gained a scholarship to the Royal Academy to study sculpture. Through her various places of study, she met many people, including her husband, Delmar Banner, who was also an artist. Vasconcelos and Banner settled in Langdales in the Lake District, and Josephina became a prominent sculptor, with a lot of her works having a religious theme. This, obviously, is quite non-religious. It is a stone in our collection, and it does feature some of the key people linked to the Armitt's history, some of which I've already mentioned, such as William Green, the Armitt sisters, Charlotte Mason, Beatrix Potter, but you can also see other names there, such as John Ruskin, Herbert Bell, and Harriet Martineau. The sculpture is made from local Lakeland slate and it can be found directly outside the museum's entrance. It also quite nicely features as part of a town trail that visitors can take part in. And we really enjoy welcoming visitors who've been part of their Armitt trail, trying to hunt down things, and they've come across us or they've come into the museum as a result of this trail. So it's a great artwork to have outside the front of our door. The penultimate artwork is called Uncharnel by John Ellis. It was created in 2012 for an exhibition at the Armitt entitled Sublime Transactions. It's made from steel, copper, cast acrylic and bronze leaf. Ellis made this in response to the Ambleside hoard, which was on display at the Armitt at the same time. The Ambleside hoard comprises of 2 swords, a dagger and a spearhead. They are all Bronze Age weapons and were discovered during peat cutting in the mid-18th century just outside of Ambleside. Now, peat is well known for good preservation, and perhaps these finds were left as a ritualistic or spiritualistic deposit. And in any case, Ellis was inspired by these items and attempted to draw upon the landscape, the properties of bronze and the alchemy of the hoard's creation to create his own piece that we can see here, Uncharnel. There's clearly a strong correlation trying to be made between the makers of the old tools, thinking about all the different hands that have been involved and used to craft a new piece, and stretching through time to link this inspired artwork piece with that of the original bronze creators. Visitors really do enjoy looking at this artwork, and I think it also helps by the fact that it lights up. Finally, this piece of art doesn't fit into the chronology of the rest of the presentation. However, I was really keen to show it to you because it's actually one of our newest acquired pieces in the collection. It's of Lake Windermere from Lowood Bay, featuring the Langdales and the Crinkle Crags in the background. The artist is Francis Town. Francis Town was a British watercolour painter known for his landscapes, particularly in Italy and the Lake District. In 1915, art historian Paul Opie catalogued a previously unknown collection of watercolours by Francis Town, which had been inherited by Maria Sophia Merivale and Judith Ann Merivale. These works, including this piece that we're looking at now, are included in the online catalogue raisonné of the artist, published by the Paul Mellon Centre in London. Very few of Town's later drawings survive, aside from the Lake District series, some of which were executed on Roman paper and brought back to England by Town after his return from Italy in 1781. Town trained in London, settled in Exeter in the 1760s, and established himself as the leading teacher of drawing to the fashionable, mostly ladies, in this prosperous provincial centre. Town is now remembered for his remarkable studies made mostly on the spot, and Christie's acknowledged, after his death in 1816, landscape artist Francis Town sank into obscurity. Today, 200 years on, his bold, strikingly flat and modern watercolour compositions are highly regarded and sought after. So quite a change. Originally, this piece was misidentified as a view of Lake Lugano by Paul Opie, but the art historian subsequently annotated his list, saying, probably Lakes, 1786. The artwork was then correctly identified in 2003. It is drawn on Roman paper, making it very significant due to being one of only 15 on paper that Town brought back from his trip to Italy in 1781. And it was reserved for the most important views. Therefore, it was really special that the Armitt's been able to acquire this piece, and we did so through funding by the V&A Purchase Grant Fund and the Art Fund, as well as some donations from members of the public. So in conclusion, and from this very brief and whistle-stop tour of some of our key artworks in the Armitt's collection, I hope it's given you an insight into what we hold and some of the stories surrounding the people and places in these images. And just to say that the Armitt does continue to grow its collection through donations or funding applications for these acquisitions. And we really are pleased to be able to share these for the benefit of the public, both for enjoyment and the purpose of study. So I really hope you've enjoyed this presentation today, and thank you so much for listening. I've been Faye Morrissey, Manager and Curator from the Armitt Museum.